Hello, welcome YouTube. This is TSR Dion of the 409th. And today, we're going to cover my guide for how does one reach the elite status of the Napoleon Total War multiplayer. How does one play at elite level and at elite standards? The first thing I would tell somebody aspiring to do that is that you need to master the map Grassy Flatlands. The reason why Grassy Flatlands is an important first step to understanding elite level tactics of Napoleon Total War is because Grassy Flatlands cuts out all of the extra fluff. There's no trees or forests to hide in, there's no hill for you to camp on. It's just you and your army, your opponent and their army. It cuts out all of the fluff, it cuts out all of the bullshit, and it's just right down to the very fundamentals of how to maneuver your army and how to use the army that you've brought. And all together, this is the meat and potatoes of Napoleon Total War and what separates elite players from casual players. It's the methods for which they use to move units and the level to which they are mobile. Grassy Flatlands is the only map that promotes this style of gameplay more than any other. So, some housekeeping to start off this guide. There's some guidelines that you want to follow generally when it comes to playing on Grassy Flatlands. No artillery should be allowed. Most of the time when you play any elite player, this is going to be standard practice, but also if you get to a certain level of skill, you're going to want to be more mobile with your army, and artillery does not allow you to do that. So, for the most part, you are not ever going to be bringing artillery to maps. Now, you can bring artillery to Grassy Flatlands if every other player is not an elite player. But in general, you could expect to not bring artillery. Once you pass a certain point of familiarity with Napoleon Total War anyways, you probably will not want to bring artillery. So the first guideline is no artillery. The second guideline is that typically the types of cavalry you bring, there's only going to be two types really. You're going to bring shooter cav and you're going to bring lancer cav. The reason why you don't want to bring any other type of cav besides this is because heavy cav, for instance, is too expensive and their combat performance does not typically outdo that of shooter cav or lancers. If you charge a heavy cav at a shooter cav, the shooter cav can just shoot it. The same is true for lancer cav, but it's just much more direct. Heavy cav is not going to survive a charge bonus from a lancer cav upon impact, and thus it would devastate the heavy cav such that they would not survive the ensuing combat. In addition, some other units you don't want to bring to Grassy Flatlands is Grenadiers, because Grenadiers have less men in them, which is a inexcusable setback. You do not want a unit with less men in them that does not provide a significantly increase in its capabilities. Finally, there's rifles. The units that have 125 range rifled units. While you can bring these to Grassy Flatlands in order to be viable, you do not want to bring too many of them. At the very most, you would want to have maybe 2 of these, and realistically you could go without having any of these. They perform a very niche role in Grassy Flatlands meta, and more often than not, you probably will not get the benefit out of them unless you are very, very good at managing the rifle unit for specific situations. So with that housekeeping out of the way, let's discuss the topic of Grassy Flatlands meta and why it is critical to becoming an elite level player in Napoleon Total War. So the first reason that Grassy Flatlands is fundamental to mastering elite level play in Napoleon Total War is just simply to do with etiquette. There's a lot of etiquette to Napoleon Total War multiplayer. Many of these are less obvious than others. And so someone who's good at Grassy Flatlands is much more naturally to be in line with this etiquette than someone who doesn't master Grassy Flatlands. And so the first reason has to do with etiquette. Let me explain this to you. So some common etiquette in Napoleon Total War multiplayer is that you need to follow people's rules. These days, because the chat is gone from Napoleon Total War, people have resorted to using the title of their lobby to post the rules. So you need to read the title of the game before you join to know what the rules are. And then if you know the rules, you are supposed to follow the person's rules. So say for instance somebody hosts a game and they say no art, max 4 light. That's a common one, by the way. So what that means, no art means no artillery. Max 4 light means you're only allowed to have a maximum of 4 units that have greater than 100 or 125 range. And so this is basic level etiquette, is to follow people's rules that they set in the title. But there's other etiquettes too that apply during the battle. So one thing that applies more so in the elite community is that elite players don't want you to sit in your spawn zone when the battle starts. This is a common thing that casual players will do, by the way. They will sit in their spawn zone and not move, and that will force the other player to have to cross the entire map, go over to their spawn zone, and defeat the player in their spawn zone. At the very least, most players will not be angry at you if you at least move your units. So that's an etiquette that's in battle. But another etiquette that is in battle is that, okay, well, most players also expect you, upon you realizing that you're going to lose the battle, say for instance you lose your general or your army has been destroyed to such a great extent that you can no longer put up an adequate fight to your opponent, it is expected at that stage, unless you've got a teammate that can still win you the game, it is expected at that stage that you will not run away and you will fight it out to end the battle soon, so you will not waste your opponent's time. That is a common level etiquette that many noobs also fail to do. So when it becomes clear that they're going to lose the battle, they will continuously run away. And one really scummy thing is that they will run around with just their general after their whole army has been defeated. Your general is very mobile. Your general could theoretically run away forever. This is a tactic that serves no benefit to you winning the game. It is just purely to waste somebody's time. It's a very disrespectful thing to do, and it breaks etiquette. So these are some examples of common etiquette within Napoleon Total War. There are more. The last thing you want is to become known as somebody who constantly breaks etiquette, constantly looks like someone who masturbates in public. If you become that person who is well known for breaking etiquette, you are likely to have a hard time finding games. Anybody that is a regular to the community is not going to want to play with you, and they're not going to want to play on your team. That could lead to some issues. Now, you can still play with casual players who don't know who you are, but you're not going to be able to become a regular of the community if you're known as somebody who breaks etiquette. So here we go to part 2. Now we're getting to the interesting stuff of the guide. So the battle for Grassy Flatlands does not start when you load into the game. The battle for Grassy Flatlands starts when you get into the lobby. What I mean by that is the faction you pick and the faction your opponent picks matters a lot to how you're going to actually play. Now, we're going to look over each faction in this section of the guide. Each faction, is important for you to know the strengths and cons of each and every faction and how you can use this to counterplay your opponent before you even get into the game. So unfortunately, Napoleon Total War has one of the weakest faction lineups of all the Total War games. There's only 11 factions in this game. Now, the good side to this is that each faction has been fleshed out quite a good bit. So there are two broad categories of factions in Napoleon Total War. There's major factions and there's minor factions. Now, of the major factions, there are only 3. There's Great Britain, France, and Prussia. And they kind of play a rock, paper, scissors to each other, but not exactly. But they do definitely have distinct playstyles. So these are the factions where if you lose with these, that's more of a skill issue than an issue with the faction itself, because these are the 3 that have the most options and have the most capability to win in any situation. Now, we're going to cover these three first, and these are going to be your go-to, especially while you're not that good and while you're not that skilled at Napoleon Total War. I would highly recommend you stick to these three factions before you really understand and grasp the game on a fundamental level. Now, the first faction we're going to talk about is France. This is the flagship nation of the game. This is Napoleon's faction, my guy. Obviously, they're going to have a few perks, and yeah, they definitely do. So, the overall playstyle, the usual playstyle of France is hyper-aggressive. They have quite a few tools at their disposal for attack and offense and just in general running you over and being very aggressive about doing so. So, the faction itself, based on the units available to it, is geared towards this. Now, the things that France has in particular of note. So they've got the Old Guard. The Old Guard are the best elite infantry in the game, bar none. They have the highest shooting stats. They're the only unit that has the fear ability, which when they come close to enemy units, that it makes the morale drop on enemy units just from being nearby. So they not only can buff the morale of your own units, but they can debuff the morale of your enemy units. They're the only unit that can do that. In addition to that, like I said, they have the highest shooting stat of any infantry unit in the game. And just pound for pound, you don't want to go up against Old Guard in a head-to-head fight. Like any unit one-on-one will lose to Old Guard, bar none. I think the only unit that could maybe... I'm not even going to entertain this, though. I'm not even going to entertain that any other unit can beat Old Guards, because they can't. Old Guard is the best. This is what France has, and yeah, this is the unit you likely want to deploy with France. If you could just get those Old Guards in front of your opponent undamaged, you will most likely win the game. Just being straight up there. So, not only that, but France has some of the best cavalry in the game. They're arguably the best cavalry in the game. They've got Chasseurs of Cheval, which is their cheapest cavalry unit, and also one of their best. So it's a very cheap cavalry. It's a shooter cav, meaning that they shoot. And they have some of the best melee stats for a cavalry. Pound for pound, Chasseurs of Cheval are what you want to bring. Just straight up. They will not only beat most cavalry, but they're cheap on top of that. You could bring a ton of them. Not only that, but France also has Chuck's Lancers, which is just a good freaking Lancer unit. For the purpose that you would bring a Lancer, they just excel in that. They excel for what a Lancer does. They do the same thing that Chasseurs of Cheval do, but in a charge. So they will defeat most enemy cavalry units. They'll defeat most enemy Lancers. They'll defeat any heavy cavalry in a direct charge, definitely. Pound for pound, you just want to bring them. Now, these are the first two cavalry units that France has. And roughly speaking, these are the only two cavalry you want to ever bring with France. But to speak briefly on some other units that are viable to bring with France, too. So, there is the 7E Lancer, which is just an upgraded Chuck's Lancer. You can bring that. I've seen people bring that. You don't need to, but you can do it, and it's viable. It's just an upgraded Chuck's Lancer. But probably you'd be better off just putting a chevron on a Chuck's Lancer rather than bringing that, I'd say. But moving along, there's also the Guard Chasseur, which is, again, an upgraded Chasseur, a Cheval. So you have the Guard Chasseurs. And it's a very powerful unit. Does everything that the Chasseurs of Cheval does, but better. Now, they are a bit on the expensive side, so again, I don't know why you want to bring that over just bringing Chasseurs of Cheval, but it is viable to bring Guard Chasseurs. So, and then finally, for the viable cavalry that France has, there's the Guard Lancers. So there's the Dutch Guard Lancer, a Polish Guard Lancer, and one more that I can't remember the name of. But, I mean, it's kind of rare that people bring these because they're even more expensive than Guard Chasseurs. Now, again, they are very strong, but I don't know if the price would justify you ever bringing them. So just keep that in mind. Now, for other things that France has going for it, France has very good light infantry in addition to these elite infantry and good cavalry that they have. So they do have Fusiliers of the Line, which is their basic infantry unit. But personally, I don't know why you really bring too many of those. Fusiliers of the Line, they are equivalent to Austrian lines, which are also not very good. But the thing is, France has access to some DOC units here in the line infantry, so it was a DOC that dropped that gave them access to the Swiss foot. Now, they can only bring 4 of the Swiss foot, but the Swiss foot are a direct upgrade to Fusiliers of the Line, meaning that there's no reason why you bring Fusiliers of the Line over Swiss foot. The drawback is that you can only bring 4 Swiss foot, but 4 is more than enough. And they also have the 18th Regiment of the Line, which is another DOC unit that is available to everyone now that they've released all the DOC for free, basically. So they've got Swiss foot and 18th Regiment, which that's already out the gate. 5 line infantry units that are pretty damn good. And so you could stack maybe 2 or 3 more Fusiliers of the Line on top of that, and then you've got like a solid force of 8 line infantries right there in an army. But personally, I don't know why you do that. You could just go with 4 Swiss foot, an 18th Regiment, and then bring 2 Old Guards. Bam! You've got a solid line force right there. Very, very solid. France also has the Guard Seamen, which is an elite infantry unit. It's not as good as Old Guard, but they are good. They are worth bringing. Guard Seamen, they have about the same accuracy as a British line, which is pretty damn good. But they've also got very high reload. People kind of neglect to mention this about Guard Seamen, but yeah, their reload is very high. That is the thing that makes them viable. So, now for light infantry, France is a bit lacking, but not completely down and out. France has the unique Voltigeur unit as a light infantry unit. Now, Voltigeurs cannot stand up to most light infantries in a direct engagement because they don't have as many men as most light infantries do. They've only got 60 men in the unit, so they kind of struggle as far as numbers. But Voltigeurs have very, very high accuracy. They've got higher accuracy than Prussian Fusiliers. So this is a compensating factor. They can do quite a good bit of damage off of that fact alone. They're not to be underestimated, especially when shooting from a defensive position. So one thing that Voltigeurs do really, really well is setting up stakes and then sitting there defending that position. So that is a very, very solid thing for France, because you aren't really looking to win with your lights with France anyway. You just need your light infantry to hold. And Voltigeurs do that very, very well. Now, France also has standard chasseur light infantry, which they're kind of a mediocre light infantry unit that are equivalent to everybody else's. They're very mediocre. I don't recommend you ever bring them over Voltigeurs. But as far as having like a comparable amount of men in the unit, they do have the same amount of men as every other light infantry unit does, so there is that. But I don't recommend you bring chasseurs over Voltigeurs. Some people do it. They are viable, because again, it is a light infantry, a standard run-of-the-mill light infantry, but there's just no real reason why you want to bring them in a serious build. Now, France also has one more light infantry unit called the 6th Regiment. Now, the 6th Regiment is another one of these DOC units that France got, and 6th Regiment is basically very equivalent to some of the better light infantry in the game. Now, 6th Regiment is actually slightly better than that of British Lights. So the British Lightfoot, yeah, British Lightfoot are very, very good. 6th Regiment is just a little bit better than those. So 6th Regiment is worth bringing, but again, as I previously stated, due to France's playstyle and the way you generally want to play with France, there's no real reason why you bring 6th Regiment, but if you do bring them, just know that they are pretty good. As a DLC unit, they also have a unit cap on them, so you can only bring one. And so that is a rough overview of France. Now, what weaknesses do France have? Well, France has the obvious weakness that it's an aggressive faction. So if you neutralize France's cavalry, you will have stopped France from being able to really utilize its old guards effectively. Another weakness of France is the old guard themselves. So if you can target the old guard and take them out, you're going to get rid of France's star unit right there. If France doesn't have old guards, they basically already lost. Because this is the main damage dealer with France. And really, this is like the main weakness to France, okay? If you can take out the old guards and if you can take out the cav, France isn't going to have too many options after that. Now, they aren't completely down and out, but I'm just saying, if you played bad enough with France to where you lost those 2 units, it's probably GG. So, that's France's weakness, is that it does have a heavy reliance on its cavalry and its elite infantry. Another weakness of France is obviously its light infantry, but as I previously said, Voltigeurs are very good at holding from a defensive position, so to say that's a weakness is really not saying much, considering that they have an intended role and they perform that role typically very well. And so that is the rough overview of France. The next faction we're going to talk about is Great Britain. Now, Great Britain is the opposite of France. Great Britain is not an aggressive nation at all. It is a defensive nation. Its main strength is its line infantry. Britain has very weak cavalry. Its cavalry lineup is a sad joke, okay? Like, God ain't saving the Queen if the Queen has to rely on British cavalry. Let's just say that. As far as cavalry is concerned, the only cavalry you'd really want to bring are light dragoons and dragoons, both of which are going to be pretty weak in general. Thing is, Britain's morale overall is kind of weak, so this even goes to its cavalry. The cavalry, they don't have well, first of all, they just straight up don't have the melee stats, but second of all, yeah, the morale kind of kills them too. So, in addition to this, the thing that really hurts Britain a lot is the fact that Britain doesn't have lancers. So, I mean, that is a death blow to Britain as far as being relevant in any kind of cavalry fight. One thing I will tell you here is that, okay, the British do have technically one shooter cav called the 10th Hussars. Now, I'm not saying you should bring these because they're very bad. It's a very weird unit. It's a cavalry unit that can shoot from horseback, but they have 125 range and very low accuracy. So they hardly ever hit anything when they shoot. Probably the only viable cavalry unit that the British have, funny enough, is a heavy cav unit called the Royal Scots Greys. Now, I've said numerous times that heavy cav is not worth bringing, but the Royal Scots Greys is different. Now, even with Britain, I don't recommend you always bring them, but I'm just saying you can bring them and it can work. So, the Royal Scots Greys, they're actually cheap for a heavy cav, but they're still a heavy cav, so they do have pretty good melee stats too. And just in general, just due to the fact that Britain's cavalry is bad, this even applies to the Royal Scots Greys. The way you want to use British cav is that you want to use them only after your opponent has committed their cavalry. So, if your opponent has committed to some type of a charge or has gotten their cav into like an attacking position, and you can kind of catch them like this, if you can catch them already in melee, or you can catch them not charging at you, then this is how you want to use British cavalry. Basically, to catch your opponent while their pants are down, because British cavalry is not going to beat almost any other cavalry in a melee fight. It's just how it is. They got to get the drop on the enemy cav to win. Like, especially when you're dealing with French, you got to get the drop on French cavalry to even stand a chance with British cavalry. So this is like, the fact that you have to play like this with your cavalry too ties into the whole thing where I told you Britain is a purely defensive nation. Because even the way that you're going to use your cavalry, it's going to generally be defensive and reactionary. So, the British cav, it's a sad story there. The reason why you don't want to bring anything other than light dragoons, and Royal Scots Greys is because anything else is really a waste of money, to be honest. Like, these three are the most optimal for the money. And at the very most, you only ever want to bring 4 at the very most. So, moving along though. So as previously stated, yeah, British line infantry are the best in the game, bar none. This is your main killing force right here, is your British lines. Specifically, your regular foot units. So, British foot, these guys, as long as you keep the enemy in front of these guys, they will do their job, and they will do their job very well. Now, they're not going to be able to defeat elite infantry, obviously. You'll outnumber them. And you'll outnumber them with a unit that is very, very good all on its own. So, British lines are very efficient. They're, like, for the cost, they do a good bit of damage. And, yeah, this is why they're the best line infantry in the game. Bar none. Now, British also have the Highland foot, which is basically like the British foot, but they got higher melee stats. So the Highland foot are also worth bringing, although in less numbers than you would bring the regular foot. They also have a King's German Legion foot. I don't recommend you bring these guys at all. They don't offer you any tangible benefit above which regular foot or Highland foot give you. Now, one more thing is that the British have a DLC unit called the 88th Connaught Rangers. Now, these guys are fucking terrifying for a line unit. And yes, just to be clear, 88th is a regular line infantry. They're not elite. They're a regular line infantry, but they have stats that are nearly equivalent to an elite infantry. So, they are definitely a good unit to bring. The 88th Connaught. So that's like all you need to know about the British lines. They're very, very good. They're the best in the game. And as long as you keep the enemy in front of them and keep the enemy from flanking around you, they will do their job very well, and chances are you will beat the enemy. I mean, unless you miss squares or something like that. But that's a different story. That's a skill issue. So, now the British light infantry even with the British light infantry are also very, very good. They've got a good variety of light units that you can bring too. So they've got their standard light foot, which is, they're an above average light infantry unit. They can hold their own against anything else in the game as far as skirmishers are concerned. They're just a very good pound for pound light infantry. They also have a King's German Legion light foot, which is slightly better, and they're capped at 2 units. Now, the thing that makes them better is that they have slightly higher reload, so, I mean, it's not like a huge improvement over the standard light foot, but it is like a marginal difference. And finally, Britain has rifle units that shoot at 125 range, and honestly, despite what I said about rifles earlier, in general, you don't want to bring rifles that much, but British rifles are pretty decent. Let's just say that. I would still recommend that you don't bring more than 2 of them if you're going to bring them at all. Now, you don't have to bring rifles. It's perfectly viable to go without rifles. The weaknesses of Great Britain, I think I've covered everything as far as like what they're good at and what their units are that you want to bring. But the weaknesses with Great Britain are pretty obvious. Their cavalry not being good is a obvious glaring weakness. This is a lot of the reason why Britain is a defensive nation, is because they don't have the cavalry really to go on the attack like other factions would. But this isn't the only thing that makes Britain kind of restrained in its playstyle. But there's also the fact that Britain does seem to have a finicky morale in general. So, like, if Britain gets flanked in any situation, if they get flanked at all, their lines will start to rout and run away pretty quickly, okay? Like, I've seen too many times where healthy British lines will be running all because you started to flank them. I think there's a glitch going on with the British lines where their morale is actually lower than what's displayed. You know, morale-wise, they have the same morale as most line infantry units. It's just, I have certainly noticed, and other good players have noticed too, that, yeah, British lines, they don't like being flanked. They're the quickest unit to run away when flanked. So this is why I keep saying, you got to keep your enemy in front of you at all times with Great Britain. You can't let the enemy flank you. And because Britain's cavalry is so weak, it's hard to keep the enemy from flanking you too. So, all in all, what I'm saying here, these are Britain's weaknesses, okay? They're the fact that they have weak cavalry, and they also have a finicky morale. Now, you can remedy the morale issue if you bring a 6-star or 9-star general, but then that's a significant investment, and you got to consider, is that worth it? Because if you just go a regular general, you can save all those credits. And as long as you keep the enemy in front of you and keep them from flanking around you, you'll do pretty well with Britain. Generally speaking, you will do pretty well as long as you keep them in front of you. But these are the weaknesses of Britain. And honestly, these weaknesses also make it such that, you know, we're talking about grassy flatlands in this video. Great Britain is not a good faction to bring to grassy flatlands, just straight up. The only way you can make Great Britain work on grassy flatlands against someone good is if you go up against the red line on one of your sides. So, yeah, like, you have to use the red line like a scumbag to protect one of your flanks. And then with the other flank, you can fully focus and just, you know, fight your opponent legitimately on that side. But Great Britain is not an ideal faction to bring to grassy for these weaknesses. But on every other map, Great Britain's a gem. Great Britain's pretty damn good. So, and yeah, you can make Great Britain work on grassy too. There are certain builds you can bring with Great Britain to make it viable on grassy, but this is more an advanced level thing than something I would tell you in a guide about basic fundamentals. So, I think that's more or less all you need to know about Great Britain. One more thing about Great Britain is that you don't need guard infantry. You don't need elite infantry with Great Britain. The lines alone are so good that it becomes a bit redundant. You've got more lines than your opponent has elite infantry. Yeah, like foot units won't beat elite infantry in a one-on-one fight, but don't let it be a one-on-one fight and you won't have an issue. So, for this reason, like, yeah, you don't... If you insist on bringing guards with Great Britain, I would suggest you bring a Coldstream Guard. I do literally mean a Coldstream Guard, just one. So that's all you need. Realistically, you don't really need guard infantry with Britain. It takes a big man, not necessarily a tall one, to win with Great Britain on grassy flatlands. But now we're going to talk about the last of the major factions, but far from the least of them. The next major faction we're going to talk about is Prussia. Prussia. Boy, do I have a love-hate relationship with this faction. I'm going to tell you right out the gate, Prussia, out of all the major factions, is the easiest to use. This is probably the one, if you're new to Napoleon Total War, this is probably the one you're going to want to use starting out. Because Prussia has so much balance within its forces. It has such a good balance of units. It has a good balance of capabilities. Prussia is very versatile. It can attack as well as it can defend. Prussia is it's, man, boy, Prussia is really, really common, even amongst elite players. Okay, a lot of casual players use Prussia. Also, a lot of elite players use Prussia. It's just the most well-rounded faction as far as being able to understand how it works. You want to know the overall strategy with Prussia? The first thing about Prussia is that it's got the second best light infantry in the game. Okay, and the only other light infantry that's better than Prussian Fusiliers is the Portuguese Cazadores, which we're not even going to cover Portugal in this video. And Portugal's Cazadores are only better in morale. So that are they really better than Prussian Fusiliers? It's debatable, okay? Prussian Fusiliers are up there. They're very hard to deal with in general. If you are in a direct shooting fight with Prussian Fusiliers, you better be doing something special, because you are going to lose against Prussian Fusiliers in a straight shooting fight. The only thing that really stands a chance is British Lightfoot. Even then, it's a hard fight. France's Voltigeurs can hold against Prussian Fusiliers, but not for too long if they're not in very favorable ground. Just pound for pound, the fact that Prussia has such good light infantry makes it such that Prussia doesn't have to do much. Prussia just has to push its light infantry forward and fire upon the enemy. And because you have such a good unit with extra range and good shooting stats, Prussia can sit there and pick you off for a good amount of time. You're going to have to bring the fight to Prussia 9 times out of 10. And as a general rule, attack is harder to do than defense. So this is the thing that makes Prussia easy to use, easy to approach for a newer player. It's the fact that all you got to do is push your light infantry forward. If you sit behind your light infantry, you're going to do some damage. That's just how Prussia works. Now, the thing that also further makes Prussia an easy faction to use is the fact that Prussia's other units besides its light infantry, like, yeah, I just told you, Prussian Fusiliers are up there as one of the better units in the game. But Prussia's other units are also good too. Their basic light infantry, for instance, is a pretty good light infantry. It's not the best, but it gets the job done. It's better than most minor nations' light infantries. And it's good enough to defend against even British light lines if you have them well positioned. They're good. They're good. They're middle of the road, slightly above average light infantry. There's nothing really bad to say about Prussian musketeers. So not only are their light infantry pretty decent, but they've also got good guard infantry. So Prussia has 2 guard units. They have the 8th Life Regiment, which is a DLC unit that they got access to. Basically, the 8th Life Regiment is a foot guard, but cheaper. This is a very solid unit to bring. You always want to bring 8th Life Regiment. I can't comprehend any scenario where you would not bring 8th Life with any Prussian army that you build. They're that good. It's a foot guard, but for cheaper. And then they've got their standard foot guards, which they're more expensive than 8th Life, but they're still good. You still want to bring foot guards. The foot guards, they are pretty comparable to other foot guards in the game. They're better than most of the minor nations' elite infantries. They're on par with British foot guards. And they are just a bit slightly weaker than Russian life guards, but they're up there. Like, foot guards, they perform their role very well. So you always want to bring these too. And so, in addition to that, okay, I just went through their line units. Prussian lines, Prussian elite infantry, they are good. They're pretty good. But in addition to that, Prussia also has Lancers. Prussia has Lancers. Prussia has Lancers. Prussia has motherfucking Lancers. Let me repeat this. Prussia has Lancers. So what this means is Prussia's cavalry force is viable. Yes, their cavalry force is viable due to the fact that they have Lancers. Not only do they have Lancers, but they've got also some special Lancers too. So one unit that they have are called Talcoys. Talcoys are basically Lancers, but they have an Inspire ability which buffs the morale of other units around them. Now, this is completely unnecessary, but greatly appreciated to have because, you know, Having extra morale buff on your units is always welcome, no matter who it's coming from. It's kind of a bit awkward that this comes from a Lancer unit, but it is greatly appreciated. And Talcoys are also not that expensive on top of that, so that is something. They've also got a special Lancer unit called the Brandenburg Lancers. It's basically the equivalent of an Austrian Lancer, which Austria's basic Lancers are slightly better than Prussia's basic Lancers. The Brandenburg Lancers are basically the equivalent of this. You can only bring one unit of Brandenburg Lancers. There's not really much to say about them, other than they are a Lancer that is slightly upgraded above their standard Lancers. And so for this, they are a worthy unit to bring. And finally, another unit that Prussia has cavalry-wise that's pretty unique. They have this unit called the Free Corps. It's like it's just a basic hussar cavalry unit. So while they aren't a Lancer unit, the thing that's noteworthy about the Free Corps that makes them worthy of bringing is that they're cheap. Not only are they cheap, but they've got good morale. So I don't know what the hell. This is a random unit, really. I don't know why this unit is so cheap. It's not a Lancer, it's not a shooter cav, but it is cheap, and it does have good morale. So because of this, it actually is a non-Lancer, non-shooter cav that is worth bringing. So it is worth bringing the Free Corps, just for the simple fact that it's a good hussar unit with not very much high cost. So Prussia's cavalry force is very I would say it's very good, but it's worthy. Okay, Prussia's cavalry force is worthy. Their cavalry force can put up a much better fight to France, for instance, than British cavalry ever will. That is the noteworthy thing about Prussian cavalry. So, having told you this, pound for pound, you can see why Prussia is very balanced. They've got some of the best light infantry, they've got good lines, they've got good elite infantry, and they've got good cavalry. All around across the board, Prussia is just good, good, good. This is what makes Prussia an easy faction to get into. Now, the weakness of Prussia is not very clear. As I previously stated, they have good units all across the board. So what real weakness do they have? You can say a couple things. There's a couple theories for how you would beat Prussia. As a player who mains France myself, I often come up against players who main Prussia. And so these players they're a very common occurrence for me. So I do have a couple theories for how you beat Prussia, but none of these are straightforward. But to give you an idea, so one way you would go about beating Prussia is that if you can take out the Prussian Fusiliers, if you can take those out without taking too significant damage yourself, then, well, you'll probably beat them. But as I said previously, all their other units are pretty good, so it's not like they won't have any way to respond to that for the most part. And, that's easier said than done to just take out the Prussian Fusiliers. It's like, oh, just take out the lights, bro. Okay, well, they've got tools to hit you back with, though. So it's going to come down to skill as to how that's going to go, typically. And another way you can beat Prussia is basically to beat them the same way you would beat Great Britain. You can do that, especially if you got an aggressive faction like France. So that does work, but I would caution you because unlike Great Britain, Prussia does have means to respond to you with if you do this. So, they got Lancers. If they hit you with Lancers, they're probably going to take you out, just being straight up there. Prussia does have some tools to respond to you with. They got guards, they got Lancers. Flanking them is going to be a dubious prospect at the best of times. So, while it can work, I would advise caution while doing that. And finally, probably the biggest weakness of Prussia is, you can say this about any faction though, biggest weakness to Prussia is if you get a lucky shot on their general. So if you take out Prussia's general, yeah, you will probably beat them then. But that's true for every nation besides France anyway. So is that really a weakness? Hard to say, but It is worth throwing in a list of weaknesses about Prussia. As I previously stated, they're well rounded, so there's no real clear weaknesses with them. So it's just one of those things where, if you get a lucky shot on the general, well, yeah, congratulations. You're probably gonna beat them then, but that's true for almost every other nation. So is that really a weakness? So now we're near the end of the guide. I'm going to use the end of this guide to detail some common mistakes that casual players make and what you shouldn't do. So the first common mistake that casual players do, especially on grassy flatlands, is that they do this thing where they have their lines and then they have their light infantry directly in front of their lines, and they'll just have it like this double line continuously going down in like a straight line. They'll have like a line of their line infantry and then like a line of their light infantry in front of that, and they'll just move like that the whole time. That's a very common casual mistake. Don't do that, man. Please don't do that. Don't let me see you doing this. Don't let any good player see you doing this. Look, the reason why that's not good, like, I know you think you're protecting your light infantry by doing that. Trust me, you're not. All you're doing is when you get into a shooting fight where your light infantry, like all the return fire coming at your light infantry, are going to hit your lines behind your lights, and it's just going to be a double whammy of like both your lights and your lines being shot. And by the time you finish that engagement, you're going to come to find out your lines are suddenly not in tip-top shape anymore, and you're not going to be able to fight at optimal strength once the fight evolves into further engagements. So that's a common mistake. Another common mistake that casual players make is that they form their cavalry into diamond formation. Please don't do this. Diamond formation has no tangible benefit. I know in the newer Total War games like Warhammer, basically like from Rome 2 onward, all those Total Wars, if you change the formation, it gives you a buff. That's not the case in Napoleon Total War. Those formations don't give you any buff. Now, there is the exception of square formation for line infantry. That does give you a pretty significant buff against cavalry, but for cavalry to enter diamond formation, that gives you no benefit. It just changes the shape of the formation, and that does nothing. That does nothing. If anything, it hurts you. I can't really say it hurts or helps, but it certainly doesn't help. I know that for a fact. So don't do that. Don't put your cavalry into diamond formation. Finally, while we're on the topic of cavalry, another common mistake that casual players make is that they'll select all their cavalry and target it all onto one unit. Don't do this. Don't do this. You're wasting cavalry, especially if you're using a shooter cav. Then you're going to have a situation where your shooter cav are going to shoot each other while they're coming at that one unit that you targeted. What you need to do, you need to select cavalry one at a time. You need to select one cavalry, charge it one unit. One cavalry, charge it one unit every single time. Never charge all your cavalry on one unit. Don't even charge two cavalry on one unit. Just don't do it. It's such a waste. It's a big waste. It's very inefficient to do that. You're wasting cavalry for no extra benefit by doing that. Let's see, what else? Another mistake that casual players make is that they'll bring too many rifles. I said numerous times in this video not to bring too many rifles. You can bring rifles, it's just don't bring too many of them. I said at the very most, 2 of them max is all you ever need. And realistically, you don't need even 1 rifle. You can go without rifle units. Just bring light infantry. Just bring the units that have 100 range. Just bring those units. You don't need rifles, really. You really don't. There are only niche situations where rifles are necessary. You can go without them. You can definitely go without them. They're not a necessary unit. But oftentimes I'll see casuals, they'll have like nothing but rifles. So they'll have no light infantry and have just rifles. Don't do this. The only time you should do this is when you're using a nation that doesn't have light infantry, but there's hardly any nations like that. I think the only nation really like that is Sweden and Denmark. But see, Sweden, you don't need light infantry in the first place with Sweden. And Denmark, well, I don't know why you'd be using Denmark, but I mean, yeah, that's kind of a necessary evil with them that you have to bring rifles. So outside of those exceptions, you should never have a skirmisher force entirely of rifle 125 range units. That's just not going to work out very well, especially if you're up against someone good. So this is only the first part of the guide, by the way. I've got much more to say about just grassy flatlands alone. I'll probably cover tactics in the next video. I'll probably cover more of the minor nations too. And I'll probably cover other maps. But for now, I think this is a good start. This is a good start if you want to play at elite level in Napoleon Total War. Grassy flatlands is your foundation. If you can play good on grassy flatlands, you will be able to understand how armies are used, what units do what, and exactly why. And all you got to do is apply that knowledge to dealing with terrain on other maps. And so that is the start for becoming an elite player on Napoleon Total War. Now, depending on how well this video does, I may upload the next parts of what I've got to say. I've got a lot more to say, obviously. This alone is only like a very bare bones starter to, I haven't even covered like any advanced level tactics. I haven't covered any hyper specific things about like even these three major factions. And so it's going to depend on how well this video does as to whether or not I'll make the next part of the guide. But for the most part, if you're going to play at elite level in Napoleon Total War, it's going to involve a lot of micro. It's going to involve a lot of knowledge about how units perform in various circumstances. And grassy flatlands happens to be the only place where that's like, where you're able to test things out the most and get the most objective look on how units behave and be able to intuitively know that. And one thing I would also like to add, as a caveat, even though grassy flatlands is the best place to develop your skills, you don't want to also be stuck on grassy flatlands. So this is true. This used to be a lot more common, but it can happen that you become good on grassy flatlands, but you don't know how to play any of the other maps too. That is true. That is a thing that can happen. Even though grassy flatlands is the foundation, you can be stuck on grassy flatlands too if you don't take this knowledge and try to apply it to other maps and learn the quirks about fighting from hills and fighting in trees and shit like this and and that. But I would definitely say it's also true for somebody to only play terrain maps and be sucky at grassy flatlands. So what I would tell you is that it's better to be stuck on grassy flatlands than for you to be stuck on terrain maps, because generally speaking, a grassy player is going to be more well rooted into the fundamentals of the way units work and just the overall way of how to move armies and to be mobile. A player that's stuck on grassy is going to be better rooted in the foundations than a player stuck on terrain. So that's why I say it's better to learn grassy before you go to other maps. So, because this has been my long time combat experience. I played this game for 11 years. Out of those 11 years, like, I've seen both sides. I would definitely tell you, overall, pound for pound, a player that masters grassy flatlands is better than a player that's afraid of grassy flatlands. And trust me, it's quite irrational. It's quite pathetic to see somebody who's afraid of the only map where they can't hide behind trees and they can't hide on a hill. That's quite pathetic, And when you get these players that only know terrain maps onto grassy flatlands, when you get them finally on grassy flatlands, you'll see how terrible they play. These guys are so bad on grassy flatlands generally. But if you take a player who only plays grassy flatlands and you take him on a terrain map, yeah, he may not be so great at the terrain map, but you'll see and recognize that this player overall is good on the fundamental level, even if he doesn't quite know the map so well. and you can beat him by using the map against him. He'll still have the fundamentals better than this player that only plays terrain and is afraid of grassy flatlands. And one reason why I'm putting this out too is because, like, these days especially, a lot of people are afraid of grassy flatlands. They make excuses. They make all kinds of excuses about why they suck at grassy flatlands. And really, there's no excuse at all. Grassy flatlands is the easiest map. Why are you bad at it? That doesn't make sense. So I'm really making a stand on this, that people need to master grassy flatlands if they're going to be, like, getting to the elite level of playing this game, you know? It's important. It's an important fundamental. You don't see players really doing this anymore. If you're going to get good, and if you're going to, like, start getting arrogant on this game especially, like, you better know how to play grassy, goddammit, because if you don't know how to play grassy and you're sitting here being arrogant, like, I can't really take you serious. You know, I've had several people try to be arrogant at me and try to be all like, oh, I'm better than you, and And I'm like, okay, can you play grassy? No, you're afraid to play on grassy. Okay, so how can I take you seriously then? Like, you don't even know the fundamentals of the game. Most likely if you're afraid of a map like grassy flatland. So, you know, it's just, this is why it's an important first step. Whether you care about all this stuff or not, it's an important first step if you're going to reach elite level on Napoleon Total War. So that's just, it just is what it is. That's what it is. Okay, so I'm going to cut the video off here. I think I've said all that needs to be said. I'll upload more parts of this guide depending on how well this video does. But for now, this has been TSR Dion of the 409th, and I'll see you guys later.